Welcome back. This time we're talking about the history of video games. You might wonder why anyone should care about studying the history of video games. I mean, you want to make games right now. You don't have a time machine that takes you back to the 1970s to make games then. Games have evolved over time, so what if we act like video games were invented in the year 2000 and nothing before that matters?
Well, for one thing, the video game industry isn't really that old compared to a lot of other fields. As of when these videos were made in 2023, an awful lot of the people who were here at the very beginning of the industry are still alive. If you do seek out a career in games someday, some of the people you work for might have worked on games that were published before you were born, so while this might feel like ancient history for you, it's just what happened earlier in their life for them. A lot of the founders of the industry are still making games professionally today. Imagine studying classical music and going to a concert and someone's like, hey, we just raised Beethoven from the dead. He's going to be playing some new compositions for us and then following up with a lecture on his creative process. Want to come along and watch? That would be awesome. And that's basically the situation we have today with video games. Oh, and if you don't recognize any of these photos, well, no one goes into game design to be famous, but these are all absolute legends in the industry that would be recognized by most working designers. For another thing, there are just so many games that have already been designed, and each one has design lessons for us to learn from. There are some more obscure, older games that not very many people have heard of that are actually really great. And might do well in the market today if someone did a remake or a spiritual successor. There are some games that are absolutely terrible, but they failed for very interesting reasons, and understanding the why of what made the game not work would help you to not repeat the same mistakes. There are some games that weren't that great, but did have this one really cool mechanic that shows some promise, where you might see a way to repurpose that mechanic in a different genre that makes it really, really special. Basically, the more games that you've played or that you're familiar with, the broader a palette of mechanics you have to draw from when designing your own games. So most game designers actually do play a lot of games. Sometimes new games, sometimes older games that they missed out on before, but we play differently. We play for research rather than just for pleasure, and we talk about ways to analyze games in the module after this one. It's also worth knowing a little bit about the historical context that games were made in, since that actually has an impact on design. Let me show you what I mean. So the first commercial video games were arcade games. These were sold or leased to operators who hoped to make the money back one quarter at a time. The business model for the operators was pay to play, 1 coin per game. To be profitable, the average game had to last about 3 minutes or less. And that didn't mean it was impossible to play for longer if you were really good at a game, but it did mean that in order to get that good, you probably had to invest a lot of money, losing more quickly in order to get that good. This meant games had to be designed to make the player lose. Some games, like Pole Position or Marble Madness, were races against time, where no matter how well the player did, there was a strict time limit for total game length, and in fact the player was rewarded with a higher score if they finished faster. More commonly, you had games that started hard and got progressively harder until the player was overwhelmed and lost because the game just got too hard. The idea of actually beating a game was very rare. Most games were not beatable in the arcade. At best, you could just keep playing until you got such a high level that there was a bug like an integer overflow and the game died at what was called a kill screen, such as this. The player was supposed to lose long before it reached that point. Now, the earliest console games were mostly ports from arcade games, or else original games designed by the same people who were designing for arcade, so most early-gen console games were designed with the same concept of the game being difficult and ending quickly. Back then, no one used the word genre to refer to a class of games. Pretty much all games are what we might call action or retro arcade games today. I should point out that these weren't actually called arcade games originally either, because these games were invented before arcades. The first coin-operated arcade games hit the market around 1971, but mostly they were found in places like bars, laundromats, grocery stores, restaurants, or other places where people might be waiting around for a few minutes. It wasn't until 1978, 7 years later, that the first actual arcades appeared in Japan, mainly due to the popularity of one specific game, Space Invaders, that was so popular that it reportedly caused a 100 yen coin shortage in the country. The game was so popular that some shopkeepers figured out that they were making more money per square area of store space than from that one game than from the other things they were selling. So they just replaced all of their goods with video game machines, and these were basically the first arcades. That's how it came about. The concept of spaces that were dedicated to games spread to other countries soon after that. Now, with dedicated spaces came additional design spaces to explore. As arcades proliferated, there emerged a culture around playing arcade games as a hobby, and as a culture, and as a community. Released in 1979, a year after Space Invaders, Asteroids, shown here, was the first arcade game to allow players to enter their initials if they achieved a high score. Before that, high scores did exist. They were tracked, but uncredited. So you knew there was a score to beat, but you didn't know who did it, unless you happened to be there to witness the score being set. Now, Asteroids only allowed 2 initials initially, but soon games started allowing 3 initials, and this quickly became the standard. Often the default high scores the game started with after leaving the factory were the creator's initials, the closest we had to game credits in those days. In addition to high scores to allow players to compete against each other, we also saw more games that allowed simultaneous play, head-to-head games like Rampart and Track and Field, or cooperative games like Eliminator, Gauntlet, and Double Dragon. Meanwhile, on the console side of things, during the 1980s, things started out booming with the Atari, but then they ran into a bunch of problems. Around 1983, it was clear that Atari was making a ton of money on its Atari 2600 console, but it was also showing its age. A bunch of other consoles entered the scene all around the same time. ColecoVision, Intellivision, Atari's own Atari 5200, and a number of others, all with improved graphics and more sophisticated games to play. However, most of these consoles weren't cross-compatible or backwards-compatible with earlier consoles, which led to a lot of consumer hesitancy to pay for a new, expensive console that might not have very many games for it. Even with the Atari 2600 still dominating, there were additional problems. Courts had ruled that third parties like Activision were allowed to manufacture their own cartridges for the Atari 2600 without Atari's permission, and that led to a flood of games. While Activision itself was mostly founded by ex-Atari employees who wanted better pay, better working conditions, and credit for the developer on the front of the box, there were a lot of other companies that just saw video games as a way to print money. So we ended up with what we'd call today shovelware, that is, poor quality games made by companies that did not understand game development and didn't care. There wasn't really a games press or online game reviews at the time, so consumers had no easy way to tell a good game from a bad game. More problems piled on. Early on, console game publishing was handled like book publishing. The manufacturers gave guarantees that their games would sell, and stores could return any unsold games for credit. Once the wave of third-party shovelware hit, lots of these games just didn't sell at all, and publishers started getting massive amounts of returns. Unable to turn a profit, a lot of smaller game publishers folded, and when they went out of business, retail stores could no longer easily return their games. That left the game stores with a bunch of product that couldn't be returned and couldn't be sold at full price, so retail stores started putting these games on deep discount, what later became known in retail stores as the bargain bin. When the market rate for a new Atari game was $40, but then there were a bunch of games in the bargain bin for $5, all of a sudden consumers who started buying the bargain games, figuring there's no way that a single full-price $40 game was worth as much as 8 different bargain games. And this set the consumer expectation of paying $5 per game, which was unsustainable. In 1982, Atari itself made 2 really bad bets. First was the infamous E.T. cartridge, designed to be released concurrently with Steven Spielberg's hit film, the first major on-release film license for a game. Unfortunately, getting the rights to the movie license took a really long time, so by the time the contract was negotiated, the designer only had 5 weeks to actually make the game. 5 weeks was not a lot of time. Usually, games took 6 to 9 months. And the designer, Harold Scott Warshaw, did a legendary job getting the game as far along as it was in a short time, but game players, consumers, they don't grade on a curve. And it ended up being notorious as a game that was mostly about falling into pits by accident and then levitating out only to fall back in again. Even with its flaws, the game still sold really well. 1.5 million copies on release day when there were only 10 million Atari 2600s in circulation. That's a 15% sell-through, and even today, that is nearly unheard of at consoles. And back then, it was an amazing financial success. Or at least it would have been, except Atari overestimated how well it would do. They printed 4 million copies. So the game actually ended up being a horrific financial loss, despite selling millions of units. Millions of these cartridges ended up getting buried in a landfill in the southwestern US, some of which were actually dug up again decades later and preserved as historical artifacts. But that didn't do Atari any favors back then. Later that year, Atari also secured the rights to make an adaptation of Pac-Man, a wildly popular arcade game at the time. The game was also notorious for being nothing like the arcade experience. The core mechanics were the same, but the graphics were different, the sounds were different, the maze was different, the colors were different, even the scoring system was different. For most players, it was a bit of a letdown. Even so, the popularity of the arcade game meant it sold an unprecedented 6 million copies, which should have been great, except Atari printed twice as many. They printed 12 million copies, making this an even bigger loss in unsold product than E.T. And you might wonder, wait, Ian, didn't you say that there were only 10 million Atari 2600 consoles in circulation? Why would they have printed 12 million cartridges? That's more than the number of consoles. Atari literally thought this game would be so popular that not only would everyone with a 2600 console buy a copy, but it would also cause 2 million more people who didn't have a console to buy one just to play this game. They were wrong. So this blow after E.T. was just financially devastating to Atari. And all these factors together, competing consoles, floods of low-quality games, lowered price expectations, multiple financial failures, that led to what's commonly called the crash of '83, or simply the crash. The game industry was getting destroyed. Retail stores were seeing signs that maybe games weren't the future, maybe they were just some fad and that fad was over, and they were starting to buy fewer games and more of other kinds of popular toys instead. We were very close to games as a medium being entirely dead by 1984. So what happened? Why didn't the industry die? Ultimately, it was one company that came out in late 1984 in Japan and 1985 in the US with a new console called the Famicom, which was known elsewhere as the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System. And Nintendo was the one that did this. They made some pretty brilliant moves that showed that they deeply understood the causes for the crash of '83 and specifically worked to counter every single one of them. They didn't have to worry so much about competing consoles at the time because so many of the other consoles had crashed and the field was clear, but they didn't want that to happen again. So when they launched, they had every third-party developer sign an exclusivity agreement with them. If you make games for the NES, you make games for no one else, and you had to agree to that rule. Now, since there wasn't really anyone else to make games for, this seemed like an easy condition to follow, but it did mean that Nintendo pretty much locked out every other possible competitor on console for a few years because they had captured all the major game developer talent early on. This wasn't great for market competition, but it was great for Nintendo, and it was also great to avoid consumers not knowing which console to buy, because there was really only one. To avoid flooding the market with low-quality games, Nintendo instituted its own quality controls. You could not release your game for the NES unless Nintendo said you could, and your game had to be of a reasonable quality level for them to say you could. This was the first time developers had to pass certification checks by a console manufacturer, known today as certs. But these certs have been done ever since. Additionally, to avoid having too many games competing with each other at once, Nintendo limited releases to 5 games per year per publisher, which wasn't necessarily great for publishers, but it did mean there wouldn't be too many games all at once competing with each other, and it did incentivize publishers to focus on quality and replay value rather than just trying to pump out a cheap follow-on. Within these parameters, we started to see the focus of games change from the arcade model of player should lose in 3 minutes or less to longer games with actual final goals, the ability to win, longer quests, games that acknowledge that they were owned by a person and could be played forever for a single flat fee. Nintendo enforced all of this with a special lockout chip in their console that made it much harder for third parties to manufacture their own cartridges, so if you wanted to make a game that worked on the NES, you pretty much had to buy cartridges from Nintendo, which meant playing by their rules. Or you had to find some way to reverse engineer their proprietary hardware, which in some cases was ruled illegal by courts. There's a whole other story involving Tengen, which was a game label owned by Atari, another company called Color Dreams that sold games on the gray market. It's a bit much to get into here, but fun stuff to look into on your own if you want. To prevent the problem of overproduction of cartridges from financially harming them, Nintendo shifted this risk to the publishers. If you were a publisher outside of Nintendo, like Konami, Namco, or Hudson Soft, you basically paid a per-cartridge fee to Nintendo for use of their cartridge design. If a publisher printed too many copies of a title, that was on them. Wouldn't hurt Nintendo, since Nintendo got a cut from each game manufactured, whether it sold or not. This was not particularly nice to the publishers, but it did make Nintendo itself a very safe bet. They made money on every console sold and on every cartridge manufactured, so it was almost mathematically impossible for Nintendo to lose money on their system. And even after all that, Nintendo still had to convince retailers and consumers to buy their video games. Because remember, at the time, the prevailing opinion was that video games were a fad that was dying. This is why, for example, the console was called the Nintendo Entertainment System, not a game or video game system. Even in Japan, it was called the Famicom, short for Family Computer, again making it sound more like a computing device than a game console. One of the earliest peripherals developed was ROB, short for Robotic Operating Buddy, a little toy robot controller that was ultimately used for just 2 games. But the games weren't really the point here. The point was to make the NES look less like a video game machine and more like a toy. Like, look, there's a cute little plastic robot in the package. Robot toys are hot in 1984. I'm not sure if anyone who bought this was really fooled into thinking the NES wasn't a game console, but the image that it presented to retailers and to the public was different enough from Atari and others that it was able to gain a foothold in stores and later in people's homes. Nintendo pretty much dominated the market completely for the next 5 years before receiving its first serious challenge from Sega's Genesis system. But by then, Nintendo had a strong enough foothold in the market and strong enough business model to give it a strong foothold in games that it's still going strong even in the 2020s.
This module is in multiple parts. Thanks for watching this part, and I'll see you in the next part, where we'll learn more about this topic in this module.